Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome once again to an educational webinar from Dr. Lane Soil Foodland School. Today, I am very excited to hear hope from the biosphere. Thriving soil ecosystems are a solution. And today we get to talk with Didi Pershouse, Dr. Adam Cobb, and of course, our very own Dr. Lane Ingham. So as you're filing in, please welcome yourself to the space by entering into the chat a little hello and where you're coming to us from today. As always, my name is Dr. Adrienne Gottschalk, and I'm coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, specifically the unceded territories of the Multnomah, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and the Cowlitz. Where are you coming from today? And panelists, where are you coming from today?
I'm coming from Thetford Center, Vermont, which is Abenaki or Abenaki land, depending on how you like to say it.
Wonderful. Welcome, Didi.
And that's Adam. That's in the United States for those who are in other places.
And I'm joining from Boise, Idaho, in the United States as well, which is traditionally lands of the Shoshone people.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adam.
And I'm Dr. Elaine Ingham. I am, again, also in the Pacific Northwest, in the area of Oregon. That was the Kalapuya Indians.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. And I see that we're getting folks all over the world. We've got some Australia, some Norway, Quebec, Manitoba, some more from the Willamette Valley. Hey, hi locals. Arizona, Austin, Texas, Malawi, wonderful. California, fantastic. Texas, Vermont, Florida, Basque Country, Baltimore, India, Pakistan, wonderful. New Mexico. Thank you all for, it's just so fun seeing how international and global this movement is in caring about and trying to understand our biosphere and how we can have hope and thriving soil ecosystems. Okay, so as we get started, let's jump on in. A brief overview. I'm gonna let each of our panelists introduce themselves a bit more, and then we get to hear from Dr. Adam Cobb, who's going to share an inspiring symbiosis. So an inspiring story. And then from Didi Pershouse, we get to hear essential workers and the soil sponge. Following some of that riveting content, we will then get to have a discussion and include Dr. Lane Ingham and myself in a longer discussion, which we would love your input. So feel free to participate in that Q&A if you're here with us today. So feel free to enter your questions that you would like to just inspire conversation into that Q&A session. And we'll do our best to work those into our conversations today. If you want to interact with one another, the chat is a great place for that. And we look forward to your participation. As always, this is a space that we're going to take care of for the respect and care of all who are here. And with that, I'm going to pass this on over to Dr. Adam Cobb. Take it away. Oh, just kidding. Introductions first. So I'm going to actually start with Dr. Lane Ingham. Will you please share just a brief bit about who you are and what we need to know about you?
Yeah, I'm a microbiologist, specifically a soil microbiologist, and have worked on the organisms in the soil: bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, earthworms, incatraids, you name it, anything in the soil, on what the interactions between those soils mean for the for us to have a hope of reversing climate change, for example. It's because of the damage that's been done to the organisms in the soil that we are trying to grow plants on dirt instead of in soil. And so we have to understand what we have harmed. We've got to get back the right sets of these organisms into the soil so we can be growing food at very little cost, where basically you plant your seed in the soil at in the springtime, You let it go, and you come back and harvest what you sowed earlier in the springtime. That's how nature works. And so we want to be learning from nature what it is, how our ecosystems put together these communities to help us be able to feed the world without using pesticides or inorganic fertilizers or having weed problems or having droughts, which are, for the most part, caused by us human beings.
Your leadership here at the Soil Food Web School. Thank you. And speaking of leadership, we have the author of the Land and Leadership Initiative, Didi Pershouse. Welcome. Will you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I am the author of 2 books. One is called The Ecology of Care, and the subtitle is Medicine, Agriculture, Money, and the Quiet Power of Human and Microbial Communities. And writing that book led me from a career in healthcare to a career in looking at whole systems and how land keeps everything, can keep everything healthy or not. And the second book is called Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function, and that is a free download that you can find at landandleadership.org. I now teach online and in person workshops on whole systems landscape function.
Wonderful, Didi. Thank you so much. We are so happy to have you. And again, my name is Dr. Adrienne Gottschalks. I got my roots in microbial ecology as a rhizobia researcher, where I just ignored all of the other interactions to be able to understand how rhizobia affect plant chemistry. And it turns out all of the other interactions really matter. So it's been enlightening and lovely to get to incorporate more of those interactions in how I understand plants to grow healthy. And Dr. Adam Cobb.
Thanks so much, Adrienne. I am just so delighted to be here today because the 3 women I'm sharing the stage with have all taught me a great deal. Just recently, I had the opportunity to be part of Didi's workshop, and it was excellent, as well as for the last year now, working with Adrienne and Elaine. Before I joined the Soil Food Web team, I had around 10 years in an academic setting and did quite a bit of research in mycorrhizal fungi. So what I love now is that I get to talk a little bit more about the implications of having such an amazing thing in the world and how they've taught me anyway to be more optimistic about the future. So I'm hoping to share some of that hope today, just because of spending some hours learning about the character of these amazing organisms.
Tell us more about that. I'll turn it on over to you to present.
Okay, let's see if I can get these slides going the right way here today. So I know that it's very likely that everybody who is joining us today already deeply cares about soil. But I would like us to set an intention, if we can, to see soil with even more clearly, with new eyes. So this was something, a term that I learned from Didi, was to accurately visualize what's happening in the soil. And it's a way that it's part of how we fall in love with what's going on in the life in the soil. So I'd like to invite everybody to come with an interest in seeing things a new way or with more depth. And to start off, I want to share one of my favorite quotes. I think about this all the time when I'm in any situation where I'm learning about ecology, that when one tugs at a single thing in nature, they find it attached to the rest of the world. And mycorrhizal fungi that I'll talk about today are one of those strands that if we pull on them a little bit, we say they're attached to everything. They are part of the beauty in every landscape around this planet. And it's really, they're really exciting that we get to share this biosphere with them. So, of course, we're the Soil Food Web School, and this vision of the interconnection of these diverse organisms is so striking to me. I spent most of my career as a scientist studying one little offshoot of the fungal domain, right? Or the fungal kingdom, one little domain of it. And I think that there's a lot of value in understanding that in depth. But to come here and to spend this time learning about the role of nematodes and all these bacteria and so many things that we don't even like really have quantified or understand the way that protists are. I mean, there are some protists that are adorable, first of all, if you ever get a chance to look at them on a microscope. But I am going to focus us on one tiny group of fantastic fungi today. And this is a picture that I took using a microscope that I had during my PhD studies, where, you know, you can see here, what I've done is I've dyed the actual physical structures of the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So this is a plant root. And I'll probably call them like AM fungi more than anything else today. But you'll see in the literature, they're referred to as endomycorrhizas. Some of the older literature says VAM fungi, which is vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. But not all of the mycorrhizal fungi out there make vesicles, so we dropped that. And then primarily this group of fungi are from one domain of the fungal kingdom, which is called Glomera Mycota. So one of the fantastic things about them, and this is an image you may recognize if you had a chance to drop in on the blog post that we published earlier this month, is that they exist in this remarkable relationship with plant roots. So mycorrhiza, myco refers to fungi, rhiza refers to roots. And what we see here is actually like an embrace that happens between these two organisms, where the mycorrhizal fungi, the strands of them grow near a plant root cell. The root opens up the door. There's like a special code between them, right? It speaks the password. The plant knows it's a friend. It lets it enter. It changes the structure of the fungi and the plant cell. And we call them arbuscular mycorrhizas because they kind of look like little trees, right? When we observe them. So arbuscule is the name of this organ. And it's a site of an amazing exchange between the plant and the fungi. And in fact, I would call this an ancient alliance because paleobotanists using plant fossils, they've been able to observe things like an early stage arbuscule, you know, in the fossil record. And it's estimated that this might be a 450 million year old evolutionary relationship, and that it actually facilitated land plants in the first place. So when plants were in the water, they had access to nutrients in the solution of the water. When they came onto those early soils on land, before there was much life in those soils, they needed a partner to help them absorb nutrition from the soils. And the fungi were like, we volunteer. We'll come along with you. And really what we have this many millions of years later is what I would call love in the rhizosphere. That there is a relationship here where they nurture each other. Just to let you know about this picture, if you see these little round structures here, because there are different kinds of mycorrhiza, and some of the types of mycorrhiza out there, because that refers to the relationship, make mushrooms. I want to emphasize that arbuscular mycorrhizas make spores. So this is actually like little seeds of the next generation of the fungi. And they live in intimate association with the roots of plants to help them stretch out. It's like, think of the root of the plant as the highway and the fungal hyphae as the side roads, right? That you get at a more fine scale when you're talking about the infrastructure that's being built in the rhizosphere, because these two organisms are working together. Now, this is what we consider a classical mutualism. So I said it's a symbiotic love story within the term symbiosis, which means living together or together living, symbiosis. there's a type of symbiosis called a mutualism, where generally both of the partners benefit, right? A parasitic relationship or a pathogenic relationship would be one of the organisms benefiting and one of them being harmed. In most cases, this relationship between plants and AM fungi is mutually beneficial. And this illustration I have here, which comes from the paper that I've cited, it gives you an idea that there's typically this depletion zone in the soil ecosystem that spatially around the large roots of plants, certain minerals, especially things like phosphorus and zinc, after a while, they can't find enough of those, like a high enough concentration of those resources just near their roots. But when they join up with the fungi, along that highway, the side roads go out and scavenge deeper in the soil for those nutrients that are limiting. They bring it back to the plant, and the plant trades, right? Right at the arbuscule, there's a mutual trade. The plant can give, by some accounts, it depends on the species of plant and fungi, but something in the range of 10 to 20% of the photosynthesized material of the plant will go directly to the fungi. And since a picture's worth 1,000 words, I have here some alfalfa I took a picture of in a greenhouse project, where these tall alfalfa plants in the back, they had an active, diverse population of mycorrhizal fungi. And these ones in the front, we actually knocked the AM fungi out of that soil. So it's the same soil type, the same conditions in the greenhouse, the same species, the same even cultivar of plant. The major difference is that these little plants that are suffering from lack of nutrition don't have their AM fungal partners compared to these in the back that do. And so it's not just in terms of the individual plant, but whole ecosystems. I had the chance to study a lot in the tallgrass prairie during grad school, and I actually took this picture in Kansas of some of the bison roaming around on the Kansas prairie. And if we were to take a meter square frame and throw it down almost anywhere on the ground here, someone, not me, who's good at identifying all of the prairie plants, would find on average that there's maybe like 15 to 20 species of plant in there. It's incredibly biodiverse. And I took this picture in spring, but if I went back in fall, this place would be bursting with goldenrod, for example. So in time and in space, there's so much diversity in this landscape. And part of why that functions without any fertilization and very few other land management tools is the soil food web, including this amazing relationship between plants and AM fungi. The soils here are typically very phosphorus limited, and it's very difficult for plants to get sufficient phosphorus if they don't have their fungal partners. This is also operating in agroecosystems. If you think about grain production, which is a huge part of what we humans do around the planet in agriculture, grains are typically grasses, and grasses have a long, tight relationship with AM fungi. In many cases, if we take a warm season grass and we try to grow it without AM fungi, it can't even produce seeds. So there is an amazing way in which these, I call them our tiny allies, are there working within our food production systems, and we get to benefit from how they help plants. So this slide, I didn't want to show you any data today. There's the other talk that's on our YouTube video, and there's the blog that can link to all kinds of sources and data. But I did want to mention, because I know that Didi is going to talk about the soil sponge. AM fungi, really all fungi, but in many systems, they're one of the most abundant. They entangle soil particles so that we end up seeing a lot of stability and aggregation and structural formation in soils when they are there in association with plants. And my PhD advisor published this paper in 2009 in the tallgrass prairie, where she manipulated across these plots and tracked for years the contribution of the AM fungi to aggregation of the soil. And she found that as there was more AM fungal biomass, you almost always saw the aggregation going up. There was a really tight relationship there. And then I, during my PhD, got a chance to go to rural Eastern Zambia. And we eventually published this paper with some of our work where I looked at the AM fungal biomass in rural subsistence farming soils. And they were maybe utilizing 4 or 5 different techniques for their soils. The FAO had come and trained some of these farmers in conservation agriculture, even agroforestry, and there was much more industrial chemical agriculture as well going on. But when I went to their local grassland, I found double the AM fungal biomass as compared to their farms. This is because of a lot of the historic damage through tillage, over-fertilization, leaving a field fallow or empty, not having a diverse set of crops, the use of agrochemicals like herbicides, all of those can harm really all soil life, as Dr. Elaine teaches us. But they can have a huge impact on AM fungi because the AM fungi are so dependent on the plants. They only get their food from a plant host. And so if you're leaving a field empty for several months, the AM fungi are starving in that field, right? They're not even eating like an accumulated bit of organic matter. They're just shutting down, going into dormancy. So it's 2 things that we should be aware of. And really this sets us up, and again, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but there's a time for a new mindset. And I put this slide here because I probably spent several years of my life, 5-6 years of my life, in the more industrial, colonial, agricultural mindset as a product of courses that I took at Land-Grant University. I said an agro-ecosystem should be like a finely tuned clock, every piece just so. We control and understand how everything goes together. And, you know, if we don't understand the value of some biological component, then, you know, let's not worry about it. But we are now seeing this new perspective, this new mindset blossom all around the world. And this is one of my favorite quotes that encapsulates it. Nature is not more complex than we think, but more complex than we can think. It was so prideful of me and the people that taught me to assume that nature could be turned into a little clockwork organ, a little clockwork device. It's much more, like I've spent 25,000 hours of my life studying AM fungi, soil ecology, agriculture. I probably understand 0.01% of the total knowledge that's out there. It's so exciting because there is a lifetime, many lifetimes to spend learning about the complexities of these systems. And I told you that AM fungi don't make mushrooms, but this is a mycorrhizal species, Amanita Muscaria. It's a basidiomycete, and it primarily associates with trees in forest systems, and it's an ectomycorrhizae. So it's on the other side. There are maybe about 5% of the mycorrhizal relationships in the world are ectomycorrhizae, and they make these kinds of mushrooms. But something like 80% of the plants in our world, and most of our agricultural plants, will associate with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Notable exceptions to that are like brassicas, the cabbage family, amaranth. There's a few nasty weeds that we're always fighting in agricultural systems, or things that we call weeds that are non-mycorrhizal, and some that can even seem to harm the mycorrhizae as part of their competitive strategy. So this new mindset that's arising, lately I've been taking to the literature that calls that calls for a rethinking in our own minds of what even a plant and microbiome community is. And it's being called increasingly the holobiont framework. So as we go from left to right, and I've got a little illustration here to show this, we used to see, in breeding and in management, like a plant is the unit that we manage. It's the entity that we manage. And it's just these roots and shoots, and it's simple. We understand it, we change it, we affect it. And then if we add in our understanding of what mycorrhizal fungi do, then it makes it more complex. But if we go all the way and take these lessons that Dr. Elaine teaches in our courses about the need for all the different functions of these diverse organisms, that the amoebae and the nematodes have a role to play in that soil ecosystem and in the rhizosphere, it quickly gets ridiculously complex. Thousands and thousands of species of things, all each scurrying about doing life. And so I sometimes think, probably people hold on to this framework of they just want to look at the plant because we'd like to pretend that it was simple. It's hard to track all that's going on below ground. It's hard to see it, to monitor it. And yet, if we understand the key players in the soil food web, like AM fungi, we can start to monitor, what does this practice do? How can we have an agricultural management, land management system where we see the cause and effect of, we did some tillage and we lost this organism, or we used a lot of chemical fertilizers to get a higher yield, and all of a sudden the diversity went down. And I mean, that's something that AM fungi do. If we fertilize the plant, the diversity of the taxa of AM fungi decreases. So it's an exciting place to be, so much to learn. But we do know some things for certain, and I referenced these earlier. The industrial agricultural practices, like tillage, they're very disruptive to these holobionts. That a lot of times the partner organisms that the plants need are missing, which is why we have to bring ourselves to or busy ourselves with restoring the soil ecosystem. And I want to just give one quick, this is the recreation of an internet meme, but one quick point on crop breeding. So you may have seen this meme on the internet, but the wolf, by some accounts, 15 to 40,000 years ago, decides to sort of domesticate itself and move closer to humans and enjoy some of the food and fire and all that we have. And then we start messing with their genetics, and we create, I don't dislike pugs, this is nothing against pugs, but we create things like breathing problems the way that we breed them, right? There's like a lot of your thoroughbred dogs have health issues. And really that's what, because we have not paid attention to that community that's associated with our plants, in a lot of cases, we accidentally bred the wrong direction. We've bred issues into our crops, crops that are less capable of interacting positively with the soil microbes. They don't have the genetic factors that they need to produce the right chemical, or to, even to call out. We have examples of where it doesn't seem like they're as capable of getting to the partners. And so we need to think about breeding in a larger context. This is some of the work I did in my PhD and postdoc, and I hope it lends some hope here that the USDA and the land grant institution that I attended, which have not traditionally been thought of as regenerative agriculture, spaces, that they're moving towards agroecology, that there is a growing interest in in bringing in these systems. And this is just some sorghum bicolor that I grew. And again, it shows you without AM fungi, they were this size. And with AM fungi, they were that size. So how am I doing on time there, Dr. Godshocks?
Or is it time to move on?
I just wanted to put this quote from Elaine.
I love that.
With
Please do.
She says this. And I'm really thinking about how the soil ecosystem and looking for life in the soil and understanding it could really help our entire society go through this metamorphosis, where, like Rachel Carson says, that when we understand the universe, we're less prone to destroying it when we appreciate it. So I'm really glad that AM fungi could be potentially part of the story of helping people fall in love with our natural world.
Depth of knowledge, from scientific data to scientific memes to just your own intuitive understanding. And there's a lot of ways that we can know a truth, right? So thank you for bringing myriad ways. And now I pass over to Didi Pershouse for some more ways to know a lot of these truths about soil and our soil ecosystems.
Very happy to do that. Let's see here. Let me get. Always have a little trickiness here getting the slideshow going, but we're almost there. I know, and I had a way worked out, but now it's not working anymore. But here we go.
There we go.
Okay. So, essential workers and the soil sponge. When I talk about essential workers, I am talking about all of the human essential workers, but today I am also talking about, or primarily talking about, the essential workers that actually run our planet, create our climate, which we don't think about very much. We think of that mostly in terms of chemistry and physics, but our climate is really created by biology, and do all the other important work that makes our work even possible. So we're going to look at this today with the center of it will be focused on my favorite theme, which is the soil sponge. Alrighty. So what are the big jobs in a functional landscape? And there is no way that we can talk about all the jobs, right? But here are some of my favorite big jobs. But also, who the heck is going to do these big jobs? So while you are listening to this, I want you to maybe take a piece of paper and draw a square on its tip, a diamond, right? And on the right side tip, right, work. That's the work that's actually going on. And on the top, we're gonna look at like the community dynamics, and on the bottom is like the essence of the place, and on the left are the basic laws of how things work. So that axis in the middle of the laws and the work, the jobs that need to be done, those are kind of relatively constant, right? And we're constantly learning new things, but those are sort of fixed. Whereas the community dynamics and the particular uniqueness of the places that each of us lives they are changing, and they're very particular. So I'm going to talk about this axis of the kind of the laws and the work. And I would love it if, while I'm talking about that, you write in the chat the specifics of who's doing that work, what it looks like where you are. So if I say photosynthesis, tell us what is it? What's growing? What's what are you seeing? While I'm talking about the bigger things that are going on everywhere. Okay, you ready? We'll try this as an experiment. Okay, so one of the big jobs is to photosynthesize. And what does this do? Why do we need to do this? Why does not we, but why do plants need to do this? It creates all of life out of air, CO2 in the air, water, and tiny amounts of minerals. And it feeds everyone. It feeds the entire workforce, all the essential workers. It feeds everyone on land, directly through plants, and also things that eat plants and things that eat things that eat plants. It feeds things underground. This wonderful photo by Phil Lee of those exudates coming out to feed underground biology that Adam was just talking about. And it feeds everyone in the water. It starts the water food web in ponds and in oceans, etc. Photosynthesis also provides oxygen for aerobic life to breathe. And then it takes that out breath of life, that CO2. So we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2, not just us, but everything that's aerobic, and turns it into food. So like the plants turn it into themselves, food, but also fuel for life to digest or burn to do all the other work of life. So fire is photosynthesis in reverse, and digestion, human life's metabolism is also photosynthesis in reverse. When we think about it in terms of fire, that photosynthesis is taking that CO2 and using sunlight energy, right, and water, and turning it into a plant and eventually a tree. Okay, and then if we take a dried limb of that tree and we put it in the fire, what happens? The CO2 comes back out. The light and heat of the sun comes back out. And if the log still has some water in it, which it always has a little, you'll actually hear that sizzling and see the steam of the water coming out. And what are you left with? You're left with a little pile of those little bit of minerals that the plant took from the soil. So the same kind of thing happens in our own bodies. So it is the warmth of my body and your body is that sunlight energy coming back out, and the sparkle in your eye. So what do we use that fuel for, whether we're eating it or burning it? We're using it to do work. And work we actually measure in terms of, like, in some systems in terms of horsepower, like how far can a workhorse pull 180 feet, 180 pounds of something. How quickly can that happen? Force times distance, or force against resistance. And when we think about the work that's happening in the world at any given time, sort of averaged out, if we think about this global power in terms of trillions of watts, the geologic work of moving continents and volcanoes and things like that is about 44 trillion watts. The work that photosynthesis is doing is 120 trillion watts. And the work that we think of as work, like motors and engines and factories, etc., is only 17 trillion watts. And of course, that industrial work is actually running off of photosynthesis too, right? Because those fossil fuels were made by plants too. So, okay. So, and then photosynthesis also regulates atmospheric carbon dioxide, creating a climate that's just right for us, by using carbon dioxide to constantly create and feed life. And I don't know how many of you have seen this wonderful thing. There's actually a new version that Sammy sent me today, but this is a map of CO2 levels at different times of year. And it's really interesting because you can see photosynthesis working here. So you can see that in February, sorry, there's noise in the background. I'll stop that in a moment. As the winter goes on, life is emitting more and more CO2 because there's not so much photosynthesis happening. And then in early spring, a lot of tillage often happens. And so there's a lot of that soil biology is dying off and emitting more CO2. But as you go through, I'll speed up a little bit here. As you go through the summer, it starts getting to be less. So the red is the CO2, the red and the yellow. And as we get to the late autumn, during the harvest season, like late summer, you'll see there's very, very little CO2 in the atmosphere. And so so plants are constantly working to reintegrate the CO2 that gets emitted by life when there isn't so much photosynthesis happening. Okay. Now, there's another big piece of work, which is transpiring water, which plants do, and it's the plant equivalent of sweating. And what does this do? This provides water vapor, so invisible water that we can't see anymore, that actually is the majority of our atmosphere. And that water vapor is how our planet stays warm enough, because if we didn't have an atmosphere, we would all freeze to death. Or we would also boil during the so we need that greenhouse effect to keep us at the right temperature. It's just a little too warm right now, but we have ways of getting around that we're going to talk about too. But another thing that plant transpiration does that's not talked about so much is it produces something called hydroxyl radicals that help to clean the air. It's like they scrub the air. And one of the ways that they clean the air is that they photo-oxidize methane. So when we talk a lot about, animals, cows are emitting methane, but a cow on a pasture is in an ecosystem where that plant transpiration is dealing with the methane as it's happening. It also turns sensible heat, the transpiration turns sensible heat, the heat that you can feel, into latent heat. And by doing that, it cools the plants, and it also cools the air around the plants. And some of the scientists that I'm working with have figured out that just in theory, okay, if you just think about transpiration, that if we had 25% more transpiration on agricultural land, that could, in theory, reverse our current global warming. That's how powerful transpiration is in terms of a cooling effect. And I have these two pictures here because when I was in India, there was one day where we were under the tent and it was very, very hot and sweaty. And we stepped outside into a field that was a very tall, beautiful, diverse cover crop. And we were instantly cool standing, even though we were in direct sunlight, we were much cooler than we were under the tent without the plants around us. And that, I'd heard, I'd been already teaching about this, but it was the most extreme example that I had experienced with my own body. The plants also transport these volatile organic compounds that help water vapor condense to form mists and clouds. And that's one of the other big jobs is how do we get all of that invisible water vapor that plants have transpired and that's creating the warming of the greenhouse effect? How do we turn it back into clouds? Because when we get these big puffy clouds like this, they're actually cooling. And so the water cycle does both. It warms the earth and it cools the earth. And as long as it keeps cycling through biological systems, our climate will be just right. So how does the water go from being invisible to being visible again? Well, first it condenses onto pollen and also those volatile organic compounds that plants emit, and it starts to recondense into little bits and pieces that, like that mist that we saw there, right? You can see it's already happening right there. And then To make an actual cloud, though, there's three things that will that can get things, the water condensed enough and aggregated enough to be able to fall back down out of the sky as rain or snow. And one of them is salts over the ocean, and those salts are actually created by biology in the ocean. And the other one is ice crystals up high in high altitude, and those ice crystals form around bacteria. And the third one is the bacteria themselves, airborne bacteria that can condense water droplets into something heavy enough to fall as rain. So all three forms of creating precipitation, basically, all are biologically driven. Okay, here we get to the soil sponge. So another really big job is to aggregate mineral particles to make a soil sponge. And the soil sponge is the structural and functional integrity of the land. And it's the infrastructure needed for life on land. Sorry, I just can't quite read my slides here either. Okay, yeah, needed for life on land to survive. So, so what does that mean? We're gonna spend a little time with this one. So the soil sponge happens through a bunch of different things. We've got those fungal hyphae, right, that are helping to tie the little mineral particles together. We've got plant root hairs that are doing that as well. This picture, that kind of close up by Phil Lee, one of my colleagues in Australia, is kind of amazing. You can see the little sort of biological slimes and the threads, and you can see the pore space around those mineral particles and how amazing that is. So that's a space for air and water for life underground, right? And most life needs air and water. Those spaces also allow plant roots to grow and fungi to explore more. So we need that space to be able to move through there. And by doing that, by having more space for those things to explore, that allows more nutrients to get to the plant. So it improves the nutrient integrity of plants, and through that improves the health of all life. So when we have more nutrients in the plant, everything that is eating from that food web, that above ground food web, and below ground too, right, is all going to be healthier. Having those pore spaces there, which are also formed, they're formed at a kind of a very tiny level, but they're also formed at a bigger level, like with earthworms and other life that's moving through the soil. When we have all those air pockets, it's like a big blanket or a big piece of insulation that we would have in a house in the north. So it actually regulates the ground temperature, and it creates a good climate for that underground workforce. So it's slower to freeze and also slower to heat up by having that insulation. We need to soak up rain and keep water on land, and the sponge is amazing at doing this. So this is a picture of a rainfall simulator table, and they've taken these chunks of soil that are intact. These are like big cookie cutters, and all same soil type, but different management. And you can see that, and we've put water over the top. You can see that those jars in the back are collecting the water that has gone through the soil, infiltrated into the ground, percolated down. And the ones in the front are collecting what has run off because it's a little bit sloped. So you can see that when we have all the soil health principles in effect, so we have living roots in the ground, we have green cover year round, we have eliminated a lot of the biocides here, we've stopped tilling, so not disturbing the soil. When you have all those operating on the far left, all the water is soaking in and none of it's running off. And it's clean and clear. But on the far right, where we have a more classical, modern system where there's a lot of heavy tillage, a lot of use of chemicals that are damaging to soil biology, no cover crop, no diversity, etc. None of the water has soaked in. It's all run off and it's taken a lot of soil with it. So when we do have a soil sponge, like we do on the far left there, it helps to refill groundwater, wells, and springs. It actually can lengthen rivers that have dried up. It reduces flood risk, and we'll look at that in a moment, and it reduces drought risk because all of that water is soaking in. It's not moving sideways across the land. So we're going to have a brief commercial break of the soil about the soil sponge. If anyone who has watched me present at all in the last 5 years knows we can't get through a presentation without the bread and flour demo of the soil sponge. So I like to say that damaged soil or soil that has lost its life and lost its aggregation and lost its sponginess is like a pile of flour. And you can do this at home, and there's actually a lot of fun YouTubes are coming out of people doing their own versions of this with their kids, telling stories, etc. So what happens if we rain on a pile of flour? Poke some holes in a cup and try it out. So when you don't have that aggregation, you don't have those slimes and glues and threads holding things together, the water just runs right off the top. It goes sideways. We get flooding. We're losing a lot of soil. Those are mudslides. And if you lift up right in the center there, it's actually dry underneath. So no water has gone through, just like that picture we were looking at a minute ago. So what do you need to do to turn flour into bread? You need to add biology. And it's a little bit different process, but the effect is basically the same. So here we go. We can pile up a few slices of bread, and I've made this brown bread to keep it healthy. Nowadays, when I do it in person, I've got little fake houses and grass and growing there, etc. Because you don't make that sponge without biology. You need plants to turn that that bad soil, that poor soil, into a sponge. So now what happens when we rain on soil that has all those pore spaces and that has that aggregation and that has that structural and functional integrity is that the water soaks in. Not only does it soak in, but it's like we can put about 10 times as much water on this soil on the right, if we're talking about it as soil, as we can on the left before it even starts coming out from underneath. And when it does start seeping out underneath, it's coming out clean and clear. And that's what's happening in our springs and our rivers, is that you see how it's starting to come out? That's how a river, that's how a pond, that's how a lake is supposed to fill up. Not from rain falling on the top, but from the water all in the whole landscape coming down through and moving underneath. Okay. So part of what's going on there is back to that job of aggregating, right? So we need to aggregate and create those slimes that hold soils together in water. And they are amazing, just like egg white, they're water resistant, right? So the pores accept water, but those glues actually resist water. And you can see here that the container on the right has healthy soil in it, and you could leave this for 24 hours and it won't fall apart. Because just like dried egg white or many other dried biological slimes, dried mucus from your nose, when it dries, it's very water resistant. So by having those slimes in there, that reduces erosion, it reduces mudslides, it captures and reduces runoff, it reduces algal blooms from things moving sideways, and it keeps streams and rivers and lakes and oceans clean and drinkable. Well, maybe not oceans, but for fish. I'm not drinking from the ocean. And then we also have to hold soil's particles together in the wind, right? That creates clean air for life to breathe. It sustains high albedo white snow and glaciers on tops of the mountains. Because if all that soil is blowing sideways, it covers over the snow on high mountains, And then the snow melts really quickly as soon as it gets warm. And it also doesn't reflect back the sunlight. So we have part of our climate warming is because soil aggregation isn't happening. It's moving sideways, it's melting snow. But when we do have those aggregates holding things together, then the snow on top of mountains stays white. It cools, it's cooler temperatures on Earth because the Earth absorbs less heat. And it makes this beautiful, long, slow melting throughout the season. And we get this long seasonal stream flow into valleys, and we don't have drought. And that's the way a landscape is supposed to work. Another big job is transforming. So chewing and shredding and digesting and decomposing and right? And there's so many different workers that do this. It makes just a couple of the things that this does is making nutrients available for new life, and also getting rid of the bodies of plants and trees and animals so they don't pile up over time, right? So it's recycling. And not just recycling, but also redistributing. So this is another job, is to redistribute, to move things from place to place. So grazing animals and birds and insects do this, that they move nutrients back uphill against gravity, because if we didn't have those animals moving things up, all the nutrients, all of that soil eventually would just fall down into the valley, right? Because we have gravity on our planet. So that's part of that reason that we want to have that slow melting snow that's creating beautiful, lush forests and pastures, et cetera, on hillsides and mountains, is that grazing animals naturally will move as the snow melts. So they won't overgraze either, because they keep moving up to get the fresh green grass. Trees also redistribute. They move the nutrients up from deep in the soil with their roots up and put it into their leaves. And then the leaves fall on the surface, and suddenly you have all of that available for the plants that have shallower roots. And then we have other things like dung beetles that move nutrients from the surface back down into the soil. So lots of different workers doing this in different places. And one of the other big jobs in a functional landscape is to reproduce. And who would want to do that job? I don't know. So to keep life going, and this includes all kinds of like pollination, right, mating, and all of the different ways that different life forms do reproduce. So a question I leave you with is, we've got all these essential workers. We get to think about who's doing those roles, who's doing those jobs in the landscape around you, and what working conditions are you providing for your essential workers. And I like to think of the soil health principles as being a lot like good working conditions, right? So if all these workers have built this incredible infrastructure underground, it's like a city underground, and you come along and just like smash it down every 6 months. What worker wants to work under those conditions? If the soil is so compacted that there's no air and water underground for the workers, and the temperatures are very hot and very cold underground because there's no insulating layer, who wants to work in those conditions? If there's no diversity, right? If it's just like the same thing to eat every single day, I don't want to work in those conditions either. So think about all of the things that we learn about how to create a working landscape, and think about it as not just creating it for us, but for the whole workforce that is going to maintain and rebuild that landscape over time. Okay, so that's it for this part. We're going to shift into a more fun, more dynamic part of having a discussion. I just want to point out a few resources. There's that free downloadable manual I posted in the chat. You can find it under landandleadership.org. If you have direct questions for me later, there's my email. And I have courses and ongoing community that meets weekly at lolly.teachable.com. But I do teach 3 to 4 times a year with the Soil Food Web School, and it is one of the bonuses of signing up for their longer course. Hope to see you there. And it's really fun to see in the names of all these people here, to see a bunch of people who've been in my courses. About 700 people have come through my courses in the last year. And we are have a lot of fun together, and hoping to do more of that. Thanks, everyone.
Lovely. I had a few moments of like, what? Like salt? Of course. Especially the, for me, the fire as the reverse of photosynthesis. I'm still like having a moment.
Yeah, that's
here.
one of my favorite things to think about when I'm sitting in front of the wood stove.
No wonder I love it so much. That makes sense. How beautiful. Thank you. So now we went from very organismal natural history and our role as humans over to big geonutrient and hydrological cycles. And so, Elaine, I'm wondering if you also, I know you've had a lot of experience looking at some of these organisms who've done this work. And I wonder if you'd tell us a story about one of the times that you noticed this kind of work in action in a field. Can this work in large scale? Can we have hope from the biosphere?
Well, caught me off guard.
I know, I just threw a curveball at you. So whatever comes up to mind is
whatever
also
comes up. Well, what I was just thinking about looking at some of the things that Didi put up was we've got a perfect example of what happens when you disturb the soil greatly and you do nothing after each event, each tillage problem. In time you till, when you go in and uproot everything in a field and just lay the organic matter down on the ground, you do nothing to help that airways and passageways, hallways through the soil. Every summer in the last 5 to 6 years, even longer than that, it's demonstrated to us again and again and again. Here you have a place where the soil has been harmed. It doesn't infiltrate into the soil. Instead, it runs across the surfaces into rivers and lakes and streams or into your highways. And think about those pictures that have been coming over the television recently, where a 1/4 inch of rain, something that should be easily infiltrated into the ground, and yet a 1/2 inch of rain has now caused flash floods that are carrying away cars and buses and wiping out train, just everything is, and why don't we pay attention? Why haven't we learned that lesson over the last many years, that we're doing something terribly damaging to our ability to grow food? So an example of exactly what Didi was talking about. Let's see, what other stories can I dredge up? So hopefully that's a good image for everybody to understand that when you see that over the surface of the ground, over the surface of your perfectly good forests and grasslands and shrublands are being destroyed by those waves. What was yesterday in California, coming down a hillside, they had like a 1/4 inch of rain, and a 6-foot wall of water went right through the middle of the city and wiped out. So how do you stop that from happening? Well, another factor that's got me kind of interested, and I'm just not really sure how we test this. Who's going to sign up as being the control, one of the control places? I've noticed recently that when we have a huge wildfire goes through a town or a village, destroys the landscape, etc. Those places where we had good infiltration into the soil didn't burn. Those are always the islands that the fire goes around. We noticed that when Paradise burned in California, that those houses that had just applied the compost tea, compost extract, and had started to really go down the road of building structure in the soil, water was present in, those were the houses that did not burn. So the real clear message is right in front of us. We can't just be out there watering our lawn. We've got to make certain that we've got the structure in the soil. The water is infiltrating, it's going down into the soil. And then your house is less likely to catch on fire because the vegetation around your house has the moisture in it to not succumb to the effect of those sparks hitting the plant material.
You know, Elaine, that's a really excellent thing to point out, that a lot of the climate conversations that happen center on carbon in the atmosphere, on carbon dioxide. And yet what's being featured and centered in this conversation is water and the way the organisms interact with water and modify and modulate those water cycles. And that's really the felt effect often of why soil acts as a sponge, right, Didi? You know, the capacity for the microorganisms to do this work. So we have a lot of questions about specifically getting some of these microorganisms out there to do the work. But so at the Soil Food Web School, we often cultivate and we grow nice, beautiful saprophytic fungi, amoebae, protozoa, nematodes. But it's tricky with mycorrhizal fungi because they need a root immediately. So Adam, we're getting a bunch of questions, and I see that you're also very active in supporting us with answers. But just so you can share something out loud about some of these questions that you've gotten about collecting some in the field. Can you use them on all crops? Should I not use brassicas in my cover crops because they don't associate with mycorrhizae? Do they not really associate? There's a lot of questions about brassicas. And so I'm just going to welcome a big discussion that doesn't just have to be Adam's show. Elaine, Didi, feel free to jump on in there as well. Let's have some fun and talk mycorrhizae.
Well, I'd love to start off by saying that almost any time I present about mycorrhizae, people say, can I buy it? Can I apply it? And especially with arbuscular mycorrhizas, I am very concerned that people won't get the appropriate microbes from a commercial product. In fact, maybe I'll put a link in the chat eventually, because we just had a paper where we had looked at 6 of the commercial products on the market, and sometimes they have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in them, so they're really just fertilizers. And sometimes there's not really a lot of AM fungal DNA in there. And I would just want to know very much about any commercial product. I can't say it publicly, but there's a product in the Great Plains that I would probably be fine with using because it's locally adapted populations of AM fungi, right? And so I'm not worried about something invasive getting in there, something disruptive, and then also just a mismatch, because it tends to be that when we see like a plant has been in a specific soil environment with a specific AM fungal group of taxa for a long time, that they become better and better partners, that the AM fungi help bring exactly what the plant is having a hard time maybe finding near to its roots from further away. And so there's a lot of that, like, it's like you put a new fungi and a new plant together and they might spend a few seasons being kind of like standoffish with each other or something, and then maybe they become friends, but we're not sure. Like, there's just so many unanswered questions there. With the brassicas question too, I tried to answer that if it was in a diverse cover crop, especially where there were legumes and grasses in there as well, I wouldn't necessarily worry about some brassicas. But if you're doing like a monocrop of canola or something for years and years, we tend to see a depletion of the arbuscular mycorrhizal biomass in those fields because it's not being fed by a partner plant, and they have to be.
Wonderful, thank you. Didi, do you have some experience in also? Yeah, please carry on.
Well, I know that in India, there's a wonderful agroecological project in Andhra Pradesh, India, where they have, I think they're getting close to 800,000 farmers in one state in India practicing natural farming. And in all of their biostimulants, they collect just a little bit of natural forest soils around there. And I think that is a key piece of why they're having such incredible success. It's called the Community Managed Natural Farming Initiative. I also wanted to go back to what Elaine was saying about forest fires, that when we have that moisture in the soil, I agree that moisture is absolutely making it less likely for things to burn. It's also creating the conditions for the saprophytic fungi to decompose anything that falls to the ground. So, people say, oh, you have to clean up brush, you have to get rid of brush. But it's sort of a funny thing, because if you take all the organic matter away, yes, you don't have all that flammable material. But what we really want is we want to have the conditions for different kinds of fungi, including the ones that sprout mushrooms, which are the ones that will help to break down all of those hard substances that burn so beautifully. So if we have a functional sponge underneath, in Vermont, if a limb of this tree, I mean, before it even falls down, it's starting, once it's dead, it's starting to already decompose. But once it hits the ground, if I don't pick it up pretty quickly to use for my wood stove that helps keep me warm, it's going to be turned back into soil in 2 years by those fungal processes and other things, all the other chewers and shredders. That's not true in a more Mediterranean climate, and particularly ones that are now desertifying, like in California. And one of the issues in California is that they imported seeds of the eucalyptus trees, but they didn't import any of the fungal symbionts that would break them down once they fall. And those are very highly oily, flammable substances in there. So thinking about the whole system is really key in fire prevention as well. And fire prevention is a really big topic that I'm just starting to understand. But I have students and friends who have had that experience of creating a soil sponge around their house and the house not burning. So there's a group called Can We Rehydrate California that Walter Yena and I started when we did a speaking tour there, that there is actually a website called rehydratecalifornia.org. And we had, I don't know if it's still up there, but we had a form called What Didn't Burn, that we were collecting examples in California of what's not burning when there's been a big fire around. I'll see if I can revive that form if it's not up there still.
That is fascinating. Thanks for sharing, Didi. I would also love to hear your thoughts as well, because the more that I think about the notion of the humans as the culture part of agriculture, as we think about regenerative agriculture, there's also the notion that our relationship to forests in the Western world is continually evolving. And so these intensified forest fires are, yes, water cycles disrupted and all of these things, but also different human interactions with those forests that historically had intensive management, even though they looked wild and pristine to the European settler. And so this notion of the pristine myth is not a reality, or that it's a myth, and that humans actually can interact with forests in a way that manage fire in a way that maintain forest and can manage them for old growth, while also harvesting timber and maintaining fire in the right places at the right time without the intensity. I think there's a lot to learn from, and I would hesitate to even try to dive further into that without having someone here with us in this panel who had that Indigenous knowledge to share. But is there anything you'd like to share in that, in your experience?
Only that I know that, yes, humans have been, in many parts of the world, humans were and in some cases still are managing forests in ways that are very sustainable, as you just said, as well as grasslands. So that we have examples. Walter Jena, my colleague, talks about the indigenous people in Australia managing grasslands. What he has seen there, that it's very, very specific and very prescribed how they will do a burn. It's, you know, it's one group of women who've been doing this for many years, and it has to be exactly the right conditions, and they're only burning off the tips, and they're, you know, it's very specific. So there's this, in the States, we tend to get into this thing, is fire good or bad? And that's how we approach everything. And so I don't know if it's just in the United States, but it seems to be our big problem now, is like, you know, is this political group good or bad? Is this weed good or bad? Is this, you know, are bacteria good or bad? And it's the wrong question.
Thank you. I like that framing.
And I'll just say one more thing about that. That it's that's a two-term framework. It's two, you know, it's just binary. And when we start to try to use living systems framework to see a whole, there's pretty much always more than two there. We can get very complex and start looking at lots and lots of aspects. But even just adding a third thing there does something very different to our mind, to our hearts, to our way of seeing the world.
Thank you. So we're going to keep playing this game of big picture and complex living systems to specific questions about working with mycorrhizal fungi. We have another interesting question about mycorrhizal fungi just come in, which I had at the top of my mind. And now I got excited about my transition. So let's jump to another one. So this is to the whole group. If you have lots of spiders, crickets, moles, etc., what does that mean? Is it fertile? I have increased mole activity here, where I have started pouring rabbit urine and manure under a pine tree just to see changes. There are more visible more moles there now. What do y'all think?
Well, I've always taken the presence of moles, looking at it from nature's point of view. What do moles do very, very well? They're really good at making tunnels and rooms under the ground, as long as that soil is going to stick together, so that they can have tunnels and rooms that don't collapse in on them. And the only place you can have that kind of situation is in soils that are very compacted. Should I really actually call it dirt instead of soil? So if your dirt is so poorly aggregated, that means the mole's job, from nature's point of view, is to go in and put giant airways and passageways and hallways, so oxygen's getting back into that soil. And the cute little critters that like to make to crawl along and eat your roots as they're going by are slowly but surely altering that environment back into something that has structure. And then the mole or the shrew or the vole, whatever you're dealing with, has to go elsewhere because their tunnels collapse as soon as they dig through the soil. So that's what I think moles and shrews and those kinds of critters are there for, is to start helping get oxygen deeper into the soil and help their bacteria and fungi grow or produce more aggregates.
Adam, Didi, experience with crickets, moles, spiders, additional sorts of creatures appearing. What do they mean?
I mean, in some ways it's not a very realistic movie in the terms of the funding that was there, but I think the movie The Biggest Little Farm gets at this, what Elaine was just talking about that, you know, each thing is making the room for the next evolution of a system, and that everything's there for a reason. And if someone shows up, it's usually because they have work to do. And so I think, you know, the question included spiders and crickets, lots of different things. And I think that there are measurable ways of seeing whether your soil sponge is functional, right? And there's a fact sheet if you go in landandleadership.org under seed media. There's like fact sheets on that link, and there's one of like, how do you measure soil sponge structure and function? What are the different ways that you can see that? And I think that's one of the most powerful fact sheets out there, in that it's going to tell you whether your landscape is moving toward health or toward desertification. And diversity in general is a good metric, right? So if you have just moles and lots and lots and lots and lots of moles, something's probably off. But if you see an occasional mole, that's great. Like, you know, among everything else that's going on, right? So
it also tells you that there was enough prey items for those larger organisms to be able to be present and do its other jobs. So nutrient cycling speeds up if you've got lots of different kinds of prey items and lots of different kinds of predators.
Yeah, and there was someone just posted in the chat, does that, you know, having a job to do relate to invasive plants? And yes, I think one way of thinking about so-called invasives, because of course many of us are invasive too, especially the people who like to talk about invasives often come from invasive culture. That a lot of what we think of as weeds are first responders, both for the soil itself and also in human health. Many of those are very powerful medicinal plants as well. So before you get rid of them, read your weeds and see what is it telling you. Because if you create different conditions, different things will grow.
Yeah, as you start to have the cellulose in the system provided by plants, now you can go from a strictly bacterial dominated soil into something that has more aggregation, has more fungi in it, because fungi need that wood or the cellulose in order to be able to have at least some fungal species survive and do their jobs.
It's starting to rain out here, so I'm going to turn off my video for 1 second. I'll be right back.
A follow-up question about the invasive plant species, or in general. So what if any appearance of an organism that's giving you feedback about the life in your system in one way or another, what if they cause damage and decrease biodiversity? And I'm going to also wrap in another question that was about deserts. And I know, Adam, you were just participating in a great conversation with John D. Liu and the ecosystem restoration camps about deserts and the difference between deserts and desertification. And as another segue, the notion of, does this practice or the choices, do they support and increase the amount of life in a system? Was a question that Dr. Christina Young from our Soil Summit last year posed when I was asking the difference between a desert and desertification. Does that practice increase the amount of life in a system? So applying this back to deserts and invasive species or moles, or even, adding mycorrhizal spores from a package. How do any of these practices increase or affect the biodiversity of a system? Do you have any thoughts to share on that topic, Adam?
Yeah, I'd love to. Okay, if I do this wrong, everybody's going to get offended at me or say I'm off my rocker. But something that Didi said about how we have to accept some of the ambiguity that's in these things and some of the multiple and trade-offs between different sides. nature is chaos and death and disease and competition, but it's also symbiosis and mutualism and partnership, and it's a tension between these things. And so, like, for the mole question, I wouldn't necessarily, like Didi said, if the moles are going out of control, or if you had a huge problem with invasive species taking over and becoming like a monoculture in a formerly diverse grassland area, I would not say, you know, that doesn't make sense or that doesn't fit with some schema of nature, because most things are trying to exploit their environment to get ahead, right? Most creatures that are out there, they're trying to gather resources, take advantage, reproduce a lot, and it's usually when all the pieces are there that something holds them in balance, in check, right? The predator keeps the rabbit from overpopulating and eating all of the undergrowth in the forest. And then the population of rabbits goes down, and that means the population of predators goes down. But we humans often, and especially in agricultural systems, we want to, I won't quite use the term cheat, but we want to change the game, because we want to extract more, we want to pull more things like food out of that system. And so if we just said, like, who cares how many moles there are, because they can eat all my carrots or whatever, it doesn't matter, but we want the carrots, right? And so then the question is, if you had a mole problem, I would not want you to just say, well, this is just my life forever, I'm going to be killing these moles all the time. I would want you to just take a step back and say, what would naturally be constraining this mole population? How can I bring that organism or that dynamic back into the system? And it's very similar with the way that we focus so much on having like an aerobic soil environment, because we want all of those low oxygen pathogenic organisms to be hiding in little pockets in the soil and not to be thriving and taking over everywhere, or sitting below a compaction layer so that when our root goes in there, they attack it, right? So there's I don't know, some people like to have this purist mentality, like, nature's got our best, nature just wants to take care of us. Or I'm like, a grizzly bear will kill you. And that's nature. So, like, let's not ascribe that there's an infinite, like, just unconditional situation here. And what I ask the question of with us as a society, though, is, are we over exploiting nature? Are we not giving enough wild space to let nature do its thing? Are we not working in tandem with nature through conservation practices? Are we letting our soils degrade over time and not recognizing that the life in the soil is the thing that leads to stability? And to all those things, I would say yes, and we absolutely have to change, or we're in trouble.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, that was a lot.
No, I appreciate that. And calling back, that also is reflected in the movie that Didi called out, that is lovely to see, the Big Little Farm. We'll say the trigger warning in that, though, when they shoot the coyote, my heart just like broke. So be careful. I recognize that was a hard thing for that farmer as well, but just be careful watching that movie. But it is a great example of these kinds of dynamics coming into balance. Yeah. So we're getting some practical questions about how to really begin the process for someone who hasn't started or already has a reclamation project. How can you get roots to germinate quicker? How do you start working with and building up a soil sponge? How do you alter these water cycles in your local lawn or areas that you may have? How do you start in your own gardens?
Build structure in the soil, because roots have to have space. They've got to have the hallways, the airways, the passageways, the large and small size dining room, the ballroom. Well, think of it like, I always wanted to do a cartoon where we showed, here's the root of the plant and the exudates coming out. And that's what the bacteria and fungi are there for, to collect those nutrients, to collect those foods from the plant. And the plant tells the bacteria and fungus what to do. So, it's all, the plants will put out the number of roots it can manage if it's getting the food that it needs.
Can I jump in there on that one?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
so I think one of the very first and most important things is to not leave any soil bare whenever you can, to have plants growing and to have diverse plants growing. So in terms of getting that soil structure that Elaine just talked about, how do you get that soil structure is that plants build it. So of course, getting plants to grow is also could be challenging if you don't have water. So it's going to be, you're going to have to do a little of this and a little of that, right? If you're in a very dry place. And then really minimizing or eliminating any soil disturbance. So like rototilling seems like it's fluffing up the soil, but it actually is breaking up all of those aggregates. It's breaking up all of that structure that could absorb water. So it seems fluffy for a short amount of time, but then it's actually going to just collapse down and be very compacted.
And one other thing that the rototillers do is as they're moving through the soil, the upper 10 inches or 5 inches, whatever you've got it set at, that's fluffing, but the bottom is pressing on that ground, and incredibly compacted soil is going to be formed because you came in with the rototiller. So
yeah,
you might have fluffed this, but your plant can't grow on just this amount of soil. The plant needs all the way down to water at the late part of the year so that they are more resistant to fire.
Yeah. And then you want to wean your garden or your farm or your lawn off of chemical fertilizers and start using compost and compost teas, etc., as to help build back up the biology and stimulate all of the biology that's already there and wake it back up again. And avoid using anything that is a biocide. So in our current culture that I live in, when people look for problems rather than trying to see the whole at work, and they find a problem, and then what do they want to do? They want to isolate the problem and kill it. And we do this in medicine, and we do this in agriculture and in lawn care and in everything else, right? Even in government. And when I make these political comments, I'm actually talking about both sides or all sides. I see many, many different groups engaging in this these days. So we want to try to get out of that sterile mindset of killing off the thing that we think is the problem and get into more of a fertile mindset of how do we create a community in which everyone's doing work, getting things done. So those are some of the things I look for, is making sure there's plants growing all the time, making sure there's diverse plants growing and diverse other things, right? So in planting things that will invite in pollinators and insects and birds, etc. And then we want to make sure that those plants are growing year round if possible. So even if you harvest a lot of plants in your garden, that you then plant something that's still growing afterwards. So there's food for all the soil biology, and minimizing disturbance, and minimizing biocides. So.
Dr. David Montgomery and Anne Big Clay, they published an academic paper as well as 4 beautiful books about nutrient density benefits that can come from that as well. So cool to see those simple principles of not disturbing the soil, getting some plant diversity, getting some microbe diversity in there, and then letting nature do her thing. Even some of the nasty, gross predation in there, right, Adam? It's beautiful predation. We call it the poop loop around here at the Soil Food Web School, which is lovely.
Do people, this is one of my favorite things that I've learned besides that fire is photosynthesis in reverse. This was from Jonathan Lundgren, that why do insecticides make more pests? Like when you use a pesticide, where are there more pests? And when we think about insect predation, so they're they're the vegetarian insects that eat plants, and there are the carnivorous insects that eat other insects. And if you kill off everyone on a farm, because an insecticide doesn't distinguish between the two, who has food first?
The plant feeders.
The ones that eat the plants, right? So it's like you're killing off the ones that would eat the vegetarians, and you're providing a big buffet of crops for the vegetarian insects. So that's why insecticide use always tends to lead to people having worse and worse pests.
Not to mention the herbivores, the plant eaters are going to be the ones that had a little bit of resistance to that chemical to begin with, that are going to be the ones that are going to come back and reproduce, causing that farmer who is sterile minded to come in harder with some of that same chemical and cause even more. It just is this, again, devastating cycle in that way. But
so in agroecology, yeah, you work to create conditions where there's more like of a balance between the two and invite everybody to the table. Walter Jena also talks about crop eating plants as grazers. They are grazing and manuring, right? The ones they go up into a tree and eat the leaves, and that's their nutrients for the tree there. So
that makes perfect sense.
In balance.
Is there
Michael
a holistic grazing?
Michael writes in the chat that snails have sex in trees. I'm sure there's some reason that this
amazing.
is important. Who's my
We've gotten to that point in our presentation. I love that. Oh my goodness. I like the idea of little mini fences for these insects too, like the holistic farming for insects as the grazers, to intensively graze. But I guess the locust will bring some intensive grazing every 7 years or so. Maybe that's similar. So back to cycles getting out of control, though, I wanted to follow up and really fully go through one of these questions that I thought was brilliant. In a previous webinar on the topic of deserts, and are deserts natural or a result of human activity? Someone suggested that deserts are all man-made. I have and had difficulty conceiving of major deserts in our world being man-made. Can this be discussed today? And personally, being a daughter of the desert, coming from Moab, Utah, in Arches National Park country, I also have a fond love for deserts. So just wanted to see, Didi, Adam, Elaine, if you have some thoughts you'd like to share.
I have a hard time believing that something like 40% of the land area of the planet, which is arid or semi-arid, is somehow not part of the planetary system. You know, for example, the Sahara, and I'm not talking about the way that the desert is encroaching on with climate change south all the time, but the traditional deep desert Sahara, there's a lot of dust with a lot of minerals that blow over to the Americas and help fertilize the rainforest and the prairies of North America, the Amazon in Brazil and other countries. And so I'm like, there's a role for even a system that to our eye, looks like wasteland. Not to mention, if you go to something like the Sonoran Desert, you have huge biodiversity and so many endemic species that don't exist anywhere else. And who would we be to say, let's go turn all that into farms or something and then lose that biodiversity? So,
it's like you have to have places that have experienced or are still building. They're building back from a catastrophe, highly disturbed period of time. If it also manages to mean that this system is now behind the mountain, and the mountain's going to capture those clouds, and you don't get much rain on this side of the mountains, and you can see this easily in any of the Hawaiian Islands, any of the Pacific Islands. But eventually, with time, those plant species grow up, they get more and more diverse. Nature will make it through to old growth forest. There will be an old growth forest there given a lack of disturbance. You have to not have disturbance. And even in the most arid of places, you can find evidence of old growth forests. But it takes a while to get there.
So I want to get to this question of like the person having a hard time believing that these are man-made deserts. So when we look at them, that the Middle East was called the Fertile Crescent, right? And someone out in the chat was just posting about Northern Africa having been a grain farming area, but before it was a grain farming, if you have a grain farming area, there's a reason, right? And we read about the land of milk and honey, and you look at ancient history, pre-agricultural history of these regions, and also just what people have done in terms of archaeology, etc. The areas like the Sahara, like the Middle East, etc., were very, very lush, fertile areas. And it was in part because they were lush and fertile areas that they were intensively farmed and tilled, even before we had all of the tillage equipment, etc. You know, it's not just about heavy equipment.
One stick at a time.
One stick at a time, one oxen pulling something at a time. That if you if you keep disturbing the land, if you keep planting the same things over time, et cetera, the land will fail, and actually civilization often will fall following that. And there are some interesting books about that as well. So I'm not disputing what Adam said, that there are unique ecosystems that have sprung up in those areas. And I think it is sort of an ethical question of, okay, so there are unique ecosystems that have sprung up there. I don't think we're in any danger of destroying the deserts entirely. Like we are what we are in danger of is actually losing the water on our planet because we don't have enough places that are actually fertile still. And we could become a planet where all of the water is in water vapor and not accessible anymore if we lose too much biology. So desertification is happening very rapidly around the planet. And back to this, this is the hope from the Biosphere webinar, that there are people, there's been some mentions in the chat of very interesting projects where people are actually using biological systems to help reverse desertification, and understanding how like a grassland is a particular kind of ecosystem that if you plow it up, it seems like, oh, this is great, look at this deep soil, but it's actually relatively fragile, because it can only exist as a fertile place with with a whole ecosystem functioning of grazing animals moving through, but not all the time, right? So things that nature already figured out, but humans are just starting to rediscover how that works and how we can recreate something like that or support its development. So there is no doubt that a lot of the world's deserts now are man-made, including some of the really big, amazing ones like the Sahara. So that's, yeah, do a little reading, and then it's all there in the history books.
Yeah,
Lovely description.
I totally agree with that, Didi. Yeah, I love the idea, the metaphor that soil is like the skin of the planet. And since moving here to Idaho, I've been having to apply a lot more moisturizer to my skin. And in the context of climate change, the skin of this planet is going to be subject to drying out, and a lot of people are going to suffer, especially a lot of vulnerable people around the world who historically have depended on arid and semi-arid landscapes. And so it's definitely something that we have to arrest. I don't think I could answer the question, how many deserts are we supposed to have on this planet, right? What's the balance there? of those kinds of forces. And you're right, though, in history, we have been responsible for creating a lot of them. I'm not convinced that like the Sonoran Desert was necessarily created by human mismanagement, but definitely the Sahara, which was a cradle of civilization, and the Levant, which is another cradle of civilization, seem to have been overgrazed and abused a lot.
Those environments, I'll quote or probably misquote Hope Jaron who wrote Lab Girl, in saying that the cactus doesn't grow in the desert because it likes the desert. It grows in the desert because the desert hasn't killed it yet. So there are things, natural selection is an incredible, beautiful process that is part of what has created the diversity of life. And the current direction of desertification is not enabling the biosphere to continue diversifying unless we work towards creating more of a soil sponge that can pull that water deeper. So as we have about 10, 15 minutes left, I just want to make sure that each of you gets a chance to fully just take in all that we've talked about. What's exciting you, and what's your current challenge that you're coming up against in your own work in finding and continuing to have these conversations about hope from the biosphere, and how are you getting through that? Because we've been for different amounts of time. Elaine, you've been talking about how to have hope from the biosphere for 40 years now. What keeps you going?
Because changes are occurring. It's a lot more positive today than it was even 10 years ago. More people paying attention to what soil actually is instead of thinking of it just in purely chemical mode. And that the chemical interactions occur magically. They just happen. Don't worry about it. We have to worry about it because we've got to know what the different effects are on the health of that ecosystem. I also think we're getting more into asking why. Well, one of the questions that people asked was, how many deserts should we have? How many are there supposed to be? Well, take a landscape or a watershed. However much distance, take the Mississippi River or take the St. Croix River, doesn't matter. How much of that land in that watershed should be highly disturbed? Well, that's going to happen whether we want it to happen or not. It's the next stage. How do we start promoting movement from that catastrophic disturbance into the next stage? And then we've got to have all of those organisms and plants, birds, whatever, have to be present in your watershed to recolonize a disturbed area. Then we've got to have the next step and the next step, and then the forests, and then the old growth forests. Every watershed should contain all of the organisms that it needs to go back through the successional process. So it doesn't matter if there is a catastrophic disturbance in part of that watershed, the organisms are there to recover. Now we just have to define what all of those things are all over the world and how climate change is affecting it. Whoa.
Yeah, those are some definitely edges of our knowledge. Adam and Didi, what do you think? What are your current challenges and what do you spend time thinking about these days, and what keeps you going?
Sorry, I was just answering Clara's question in the chat. I think so. So on the big scale, the projects that I see happening both in India, in Andhra Pradesh specifically, but also now the whole country of India has declared that it's going to become a natural farming country. That gives me a lot of hope. And likewise, there in a lot of different African countries, there are agroecological processes and projects and learning happening that I think there is knowledge that is being created, new knowledge being created, and old wisdom being revived that I think is living now in those two areas of the world in many ways, that we're starting to get some back and forth and starting to get some ideas back and moving back and forth. And I think that we're going to start to see things happening in places like Africa and India that are so inspiring, that and we're going to start to see that some of the countries that are not adopting these principles are going to start having worse heat waves, and those places are going to be figuring out how to deal with heat waves and drought and flooding, etc. And how to actually prevent those things. So I think we're going to learn by doing. It's too late to just do research. We need to actually get out there and just do the stuff that we know enough now. And I think there are people who are starting to do that in other parts of the world from where I live. So that's one thing. Very personally, I have a group that meets weekly, and they're all people who have taken classes with me. They're from around the world. And we are working on trying to learn how to image living systems at work, to see them, to see them in our minds, to use real life examples from our own life and work, to understand how living systems work, and to also find intervention points, places where we can make one small change that the whole system around it shifts. And we're thinking about that in terms of land, but also in terms of the human systems that influence land. So how does a community work? How does a healthcare system work? How does the educational system in your region work? And those conversations are absolutely fascinating. And that's like what sustains me on a week-to-week basis, is having a small group of people that's doing that together. So if you want to know more about that, feel free to send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat again.
I love that you started that sentence with like the imagery, the like getting a snapshot to visualize and see it. So then when you like broadened out to the human systems, I was like trying to imagine how, like what that photograph would look like. It got very complex, and I love that. That's so neat. How about you, Adam?
It's about being able to see systems more completely, because we so often look at a little part.
Right, or we only interface with the parts of it that are personal to us, right? And in that way, then we get things of like not in my backyard situations, and being able to see the whole. How do you see a whole system? What have you learned about how to do that? How do you put those goggles on?
Through living systems frameworks. So there are actual frameworks you can use to develop questions in order to be able to see the whole thing at work better. And that is something I have learned very much so from a woman named Carol Sanford, who's an author and teacher.
So Adrian, thanks for asking for my input on this as well. I think of two quotes when I think about hope. Aldo Leopold, who I've cited many times in these webinars, said that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that you often feel like you live alone in a world full of wounds, right? So when I pass erosion on a hillside in a car, I might be the only person in that car who goes, the Earth's skin is drying out over there. The microbes are screaming, like, what's going on here? Why can't we see with these eyes about the living world? But then Mr. Rogers talked about how when he used to get scared of news as a child and talk to his mother about, like, look at all the bad stuff happening, she would say to him, look at all the people who are helping. And I think that that's what Elaine and Didi have said here as well, is that, you know, I think that there's a role to try to convince people in the other paradigms of food production, or, you know, all this food system stuff, like the traditional way of seeing global food security is so antithetical to some of the things that we've talked about, because it's not, it doesn't exist within that framework that Didi is talking about, that holistic approach. It's like stamp out fires, right? A lot of times stamp out fires all around the world and never step back and look at the system. But I'm finding here in this community a lot of people who are saying, we can't get better results with the same broken way that we're approaching food production. We absolutely have to just jump in there and start transforming soil management in this world and bring in these principles that have a completely different end goal in a lot of ways to them. And I mean, we want abundant food, obviously, still. We want people to be able to make profit as they're land managing and all, so that they can keep doing it. We don't want billions of people to starve. And yet our eyes are on a completely different landscape that we're trying to travel to, a different relationship between humans and the world than the sort of industrial, colonial, chemical, agricultural model. There's a time and a place, and I try to do this all the time, to reach back and say, how do I make inroads of pulling some of the people that see agriculture that way, many of whom are good friends of mine that are industrial farmers and ranchers? How do I get them to open their eyes to regeneration? Well, I also have to just sometimes say, they're going to do them. And I have a community of people here that are looking for the answers. And that's where I'm going to focus a lot of my time and energy. So, like, for lack of a better term, the students and the community at the Civil Food Web School is like my biggest source of hope. And people like you, Adrian and Elaine, that I work with.
Thank you.
With as well, Adam. And this has been just such a lovely conversation. Thank you, three. It is an honor always to speak with each of you. So thank you for your time. And I am so filled with hope and excited to look into all of these links that I've been pulling up that y'all have been sharing in the chat. Thank you for sharing your expertise. Feel free to put yourself out there in your, if you're working on projects, your project web pages, your Instagram. It's always fun to make as interconnected of a community, this not just soil food web, but the human net web associated to be connected. So it's lovely to see you all today, and thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.
Don't forget to click that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell to stay updated with all our new videos.
The students who have been coming to my classes from the Soil Food Web community are really marvelous, and I love their enthusiasm.